So again, Rich Kohng, Assistant Vice President for Civic Engagement here at North Park University, with my colleague.
Hi, Dr. Amy Governale. I'm a developmental psychologist and an assistant professor here at North Park University.
Okay, we've been working on our stand-up routine. We'll see how it goes today. So often in the church we start with a text, a passage, scripture, then we unpack it from there. We talk about the implications of that. We're going to work a little bit in reverse here. So we're going to actually talk about some research. And so this comes from Robert Sampson. He used to be at the University of Chicago. Now he's at Harvard University. And he wrote this book called The Great American City to really detail some of his key research and findings. And the question that he was asking, his research question, was really, why are some neighborhoods characterized by deep social divisions and violence while others thrive? Why do most cities exhibit sharp neighborhood differences in wealth and poverty? And so this is really the billion-dollar question, if not more. The question of why is it that certain neighborhoods really face and deal with more violence that seems durable to those spaces, and why some communities don't. And so this is really a huge question that, at the end of the day, Building Blocks is trying to engage as well. And what he found through all of his research, this was the Project for Human Development in Chicago Neighborhoods, a PhDCN. And through this research, what he found is this idea of collective efficacy. That this was really the difference when communities were able to rebound from violence and communities that may be continuing to perpetually struggle with violence. And so he did actually an analysis here of Chicago and Stockholm, two very different cities. He mapped various neighborhoods based on their scores in collective efficacy. And if you just look at the trend here, we don't have a line going through it, but you'll notice that Chicago has more violence than Stockholm. And what you'll notice is that the higher the collective efficacy, the lower the violence rate. And this is a very important finding, because what he's basically saying is that the determining predictive factor here is his concept collective efficacy. So I've spoken a lot about this, so what is it?
Well, I have some slides too.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Sampson's research became well known in the early 2000s, but I just wanted to throw some slides in here to show we tried to replicate this work last summer. And some of you who work, I know Brothers in Christ, did a lot of really great work in spreading our building block survey. And you can see here, I did include a line. We found the exact same relationship. This is still something that is operating in our neighborhoods. The relationship between the more collective advocacy that your community members, your participants, people who you work with and serve, the higher collective advocacy they are reporting, the lower level of violence they find in their neighborhoods. So we're already seeing that this is still incredibly relevant today, both with our violence and with our perceptions of neighborhood safety, almost the opposite, right? So the higher collective efficacy, it's not just that there's lower instances of violence, but physically the more safe people are feeling in their neighborhoods.
And so the question is, given these findings, what is collective efficacy? So Sampson defines it as really two key components. The first is social cohesion, and then the second one is shared expectation for social control. When we think of social cohesion, of course, it's at the individual level, but it could also happen at the organizational level, the broader community level. And so where there's more social cohesion within the community, it's going to be more durable to these sort of challenges like violence. Also, shared expectation for social control. We're going to unpack that in a little more detail because this may not be as familiar. He's not talking about social control like manipulating people, this sort of thing. There's a little bit more nuance to what he's saying here. So just in his own words, he says this. Collective efficacy theory goes further to argue that repeated interactions, observations of interactions, and awareness of potential interactions that could be invoked all establish shared norms, a sense of the we, beyond the strong ties among friends and kin. So very interesting framework here. What he means is this sense of the we in a particular neighborhood. And so put differently, a person could perceive trust and infer shared expectations about public behavior without having to know their neighbors in the urban village sense of cohesion. Why he's defining this, why this is so important, because historically in social sciences, he was very concerned with the idea that often when there's social challenges like violence, where we land on is we blame human responsibility for these issues, right? We blame the individual. So we say that, well, this act of violence happened because those individuals were violent. And in his research, he actually pushed back on that significantly. And what he was basically saying is that we need to rethink this because that's not what actually the data shows, that individuals can act within a concept of collectivity that leads to certain patterns of behavior. And we don't have time to go deeper into that. But let me give an example. So for example, my family immigrated here from South Korea in the 70s. And if you go to a restaurant where they have something like this, you have arrived in a Korean barbecue restaurant. Now, if you notice this thing in the middle, this grating here, is not for decoration. It has a purpose. And the purpose is to flame and cook your meat. And if you go to a Korean barbecue restaurant and you sit down, now again, I think veganism, vegetarians, pescatarians, it's great. I need to do more of that. But the truth is, if you go into one of these restaurants, you see that thing in the middle, you tell them, can I order some vegetables? A Korean restaurant owner is going to look at you very funny. And you'll notice other people in the restaurant are going to look at you funny as well. There's a certain shared expectation that every person sitting at this restaurant, sitting around these tables, will order what we call kalbi, or bulgogi, which are these marinated meats that you're going to cook at the table. This is kind of a very, not a great analogy, but somewhat of a way to approach what Samson's getting at. I don't think he told the story like this. But the idea that, there are public spaces where when you walk in, there's certain expectations for social control. And you kind of feel that, right? It's almost like a peer pressure. And it's not specific to the individuals in the room. It could be complete strangers who walk in and they somehow align with these expectations. This is why in some communities you'll see there's no trash on the ground. You'll notice in this room there's no trash on the ground. There's certain expectations for social control. So that being said, if collective efficacy is predictive in terms of rates of violence, the question becomes, well, how do you build more of it? Because if we actually know this based on the data, how do you build it? And this is really interesting. This is where Samson lands. He said, despite persistent poverty, racial diversity, and other social challenges, community-based organizations strongly predict collective efficacy and collective civic action, durably so. It is the totality of the institutional infrastructure that seems to matter in producing healthy communities. Think about what he's saying there for a moment. It's something that many communities of color have known for generations. What's driving collective efficacy? Local, community-based organizations. I want to underscore local. So we often, as the city of Chicago or the state of Illinois or federal government, we fund initiatives, which is great, but that's a free-for-all in terms of who gets the resources and money to do the work on the ground. But Samson's research is saying that these local community organizations are the ones that increase and drive collective efficacy. It's the ones who are local, who are already there. And so one of the things that they looked at were community gatherings and civic gatherings across communities across Chicago. And if you'll look at this chart, he documented civic events. They studied thousands of these events. Civic events were just kind of like a gathering. It could be like a St. Patrick's Day gathering. They looked at protest events. And this is where protest events, community members were gathering to change something. They wanted to see something change in their neighborhood. And then hybrid events are a combination of the two. And just look here at the areas that are not shaded. What you'll find, these are areas of low organizational density, not many local community organizations there. And how many protests or civic events or hybrid events do you see? And Samson would say, you don't see very many. So the point that he's trying to make is that if we really want to engage the issue of violence within our communities, we need to invest in the local community-based organizations that are driving collective efficacy. And so he says the irony is that community organizations and the nonprofit organizational sector more generally are the unsung heroes titling against the narrative of community loss. These community organizations are vital to that work, which many of you in this room actually lead. And so do you also happen to know of any other institutions that increase social cohesion and enhance expectation for social control? We have local nonprofits, of course, community convenings. There's something called the church. I mean, if you think about it for a moment, do churches increase social cohesion? Well, Acts chapter 2, verse 44 says, all the believers were together, had everything in common. They sold property possession to give anyone as they had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes, ate together. Churches drive social cohesion, do they not? They also do something else. They enhance expectation for social control. The church, we call this the kingdom of God. But in Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 7, it says, but seek the welfare of the city where I've sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf for its welfare, and you will find your welfare. Which is why we need to continue to deepen connections between networks, community organizations, faith-based community orgs, and churches, as well as ensure that they're the ones who have the resources to scale impact. Because if they're the ones driving collective efficacy, should we not as a society invest more in these organizations?
I think a lot of times when we're thinking about research, we're thinking about psychology, you hear a lot of stuff about perceptions, right? We're asking people, how do you feel about things? But one of the things, and very much as Dr. Kohng has been saying, and we want to emphasize, is that this research is about action. It's not just about your sense of belonging, it's about the steps that community members are taking together. Not just how they feel about each other, but the work they're doing together. And when we did our survey last summer, looking at those types of actions, and we very specifically picked out scales that would try to look at these types of behaviors, we found that a lot of our participants were saying things like they worked with these local nonprofits, that they were working with their neighbors to solve problems. Where we saw lower rates where people were not saying as much or reporting as much engagement were things like going to rallies, getting involved in the protest events, the phone banking, the talking to neighbors about political issues. Those types of activities that we know can really be encouraged through local organizations, through churches in ways that help bring people together in that social cohesion, we think can really be an important step.
And so in order to really address this, so just a little bit of proprietary information from our part. So with some funds from the Lilly Endowment, we convened something called the Community Assets Cohort. And what we really tried to do with this initiative is really, we've seen this disparity that oftentimes, again, like we as a society fund initiatives where the money could go anywhere, but the local community-based organizations that are actually trying to really mitigate violence within local communities ironically are not the ones getting the resources and money to do the work because of implicit bias in philanthropy, in fundraising, grant making, etc. And so what we did is we said, well, you know, like so many local faith leaders of color who are doing this incredible work, they're volunteering their time through their churches because of the history and legacy of the Black church and also the Hispanic churches. They're doing this incredible work, but they're not getting compensated for it. They're not getting more resources to scale it. And so in light of this issue, we said, well, you know, many local leaders, like they're not going to allocate $70,000 for someone to do spreadsheets in a back office because they know everyone in the community and what's at stake. And we said, well, we have researchers on campus like Dr. Governale who could actually provide program evaluation so that then local leaders and local organizations can get the resources, the funds, reach out to philanthropy to get the funds to scale their work on the ground. We just started this initiative last year. Excited to announce actually one of our partners actually just got a $100,000 grant to hire their first executive director from Cook County. And so this is something we're doing. And actually one thing we also found out is that the federal government has these faith-based offices to really route funds to local community faith-based organizations. And we found that the state of Illinois doesn't have an office like that, although many states do. We thought this was really curious given the fact that so many local community-based organizations on the ground in Chicago are driving incredible work. And if there was an office in Illinois like that, these RFPs, requests for proposals, come out and you have to apply within the month. If you're so busy doing the work, how are you going to apply for this? So if someone's in that office, they may be able to highlight, hey, you should apply for this. So we're encouraging all of you to advocate for this office. Governor Pritzker, we've found, is very open to building an office like this. And so this is the last slide. I know we're at time. And so again, I just want to circle back very briefly. If we know collective efficacy is predictive of higher or lower rates of violence, then maybe we should really rethink like how the church, the faith community operates in these spaces. Because if it's local community-based organizations that are driving this work, you know, I know that there's some of you who come from suburban contexts. The book of Acts was written it was describing a group of people in a city who were convening together, breaking bread together. It didn't actually delineate various neighborhoods. They were just aggregating together, bringing whatever they had. For our context, for those of you in suburban context, what would it look like if we did Acts chapter 2 here? To say, you know, it's not just my church in Wilmette, but we're the church of Chicago. Although I know suburbans like to claim Chicago, we're going to say you're all part of Chicago. What would it look like if we all brought what was together and we really started to say, look, whatever we could bring our offerings and tithes to the table to honor the work of local leaders who are located in the neighborhoods that are dealing with more violence, what would that look like? What if local churches across Chicago, if your neighborhood is not dealing with much violence, what if you said, let's be a part of honoring the work of leaders on the ground who are doing this kind of work? That could be incredible testimony and witness to the broader city and country at large. And I think that is really the heartbeat of what can really mitigate violence through the city of Chicago. So thank you all. Appreciate your time. Thank you, Governor.